So we're gonna just jump right into it. Our moderator today for this panel is none other than Richard Marker, who is the co-principal of the Institute of Wise Philanthropy, a boutique philanthropy education and strategy firm. He also teaches philanthropists and foundations from around the world at Penn's Center of High Impact Philanthropy and previously at NYU. A longtime thought leader and practitioner in the field, he has lectured in 40 countries and throughout the United States, a man with a wealth of knowledge and experience. Now here to take it away, Batman, Mr. Richard Marker, whenever you're ready.
Hi there. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's certainly terrific to be back with Opal. Now, I do want to start, before I get started, I just want to point out that this is the first time since the first week of March that I put a tie on. And that's because those of you who are watching from Opal events know that I'm known as the bow tie guy. And it would be, even though this is virtual, it would be shocking for me to show up at an Opal event without my uniform. And anyway, it's terrific to be here, and we have an important panel. We're actually going to extend the topic. It says in the philanthropy in the wake of COVID-19. The last month has suggested that there's some larger systemic issues in society that also are tied into how philanthropy has responded. So before we get started with some of the questions, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves briefly so you have a sense of the depth of who's on the panel, and then we're going to go directly into the questions. Kris, why don't you start?
Sure, thank you, Richard. Wonderful to be here. My name is Kris Putnam-walkerly, and I'm president of Putnam Consulting Group. I've been advising high net worth donors, family offices, and leaders of foundations for the past 20 years, really all to help them increase the clarity, impact, and joy of their giving. And I also just authored a new book, which I coincidentally have a copy of right here, called Delusional Altruism.
Okay, Chuck, why don't you go next?
Yes, thank you very much, Richard. We are Stetson Family Office. We are 101 years old this year in August. And what we focused on is, I'm going to call it leadership philanthropy, where we take the lead, we identify a societal need, and we go after that. We've had a lot of good success on it. In the educational side, we've been endorsed by every major newspaper in the United States, had the cover of Time magazine, done the Today Show. And now we're focused on healthcare, and look forward to being part of this panel.
Terrific. Okay, Leslie?
I am Leslie Pine, managing partner of the Philanthropic Initiative, otherwise known as TPI. And we started up 31 years ago, 1989, with the mission of helping all different types of funders to increase the impact of their philanthropy. So we work with individual donors, families, companies that want help with their corporate philanthropy, some independent foundations, some community foundations. And we provide consulting and program management services to our clients. And we also do as much as we can to really try to build the field of philanthropy through thought leadership, research, writing, teaching, workshops for donors and others.
Good. And Ellen?
Hi, Ellen Israelson from the Jewish Communal Fund in New York. JCF is the largest Jewishly affiliated donor advised fund in the country. We've been around for pretty close to 50 years. And at this point, we're very multi-generational. So I have an opportunity to sometimes be working with 3 generations in a particular family, which gives an interesting viewpoint. I head up the private client group there, where I help clients think about strategies and ways of focusing their philanthropy.
Okay, that's terrific. Not surprisingly, we have a wealth of knowledge here. The only thing I would add to the introduction that was given about me is that, and it's relevant to this discussion, is that I myself am a 3rd generation funder, and that gives a little bit of a perspective on being not only an educator, a professional, but also a funder myself, and that I think gives a perspective. Now, here's what the initial instinct in response to COVID-19 and some of the subsequent issues in American society. The starting point was, what's changed? But one of the things I've discovered when I've spoken to people outside of our field is that not everybody knows what we've done differently over the last 3 or 4 months. And I think it's important for us to take, not assume that we're talking within the Beltway, as now that I live in Washington, I talk that way. Not to assume we're using inside the Beltway vocabulary and assumptions, but let's take a couple of minutes to articulate what we think has changed in the philanthropy field in response to profound changes in American or world society, but certainly American society. Ellen, why don't you start it and other people will follow?
Sure. There's 2 tracks that I've seen emerging, and I can tell you a little bit of specifics about what I've seen in the day-to-day in terms of people's grant making, because we're working with a little over, well, about 4,500 different families and individuals. So it gives you an interesting snapshot. I mean, initially what we saw was people not only switching to a lot of support for relief organizations, hospitals, healthcare. People started to really ask themselves when they saw the state that the grantee organizations, the charitable organizations were in when the crisis emerged, and they saw the lack of preparedness and the weakness and no reserves, no cash reserves. I mean, kind of, could they even get through the month? That was a big wake-up call for people. I mean, for years, people have talked about endowments and budgets and revenue streams and what's your business model. But I feel that was always in the background because it's so much more fun and interesting to talk about program or even evaluation and this sort of nitty-gritty operational things that give you capacity and strength and resilience. We're not so much part of a conversation, and I saw that shifting very quickly. The other thing that happened, and I know some of the other panelists are going to comment on this, is it showed not only certain weaknesses in the not-for-profit sector, but in society overall, in our basic structures. I mean, some of that, and I know you have a lot to say, falls in the bailiwick of the government or whose job is this, but certainly it has made philanthropists take another look at what they're trying to do with their funding and their missions.
Okay. Kris, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in some of the people you're working with. You're on mute.
Thank you. I am seeing philanthropy respond actually in 5 different ways. And the first, interestingly, is hiding. So I think there's really, as much as there's been an amazing response from philanthropy, and we'll all talk about that in a little bit, there are quite a number of donors who are nowhere to be found. In fact, there was just some data that came out from WealthX yesterday that indicated that only 10% of the world's billionaires have given in response to COVID-19. And I think that's a bit stunning, really. And so there are quite a few that are hiding. There are many that are waiting and seeing to see how this all shakes out. And I think, you know, in both of those cases, there's a bit of fear and overwhelm and unawareness of what to do or how to respond that's holding people back. But certainly there are obviously lots of donors that are giving rapidly. There are many rapid response funds in the US. I think over 500 rapid response funds have been created in communities across the country, which are many donors, foundation leaders, corporate givers, family offices coming together to support response in those communities. A lot of funders are really adapting and donors adapting how they are funding. So giving more quickly, loosening restrictions, not even requiring additional applications, but giving their existing grantees more funds to do what they need to do and really trusting those nonprofits. And then a lot of family offices and donors, and I think the ones that are really going to be leading the way are the ones who are truly transformational. They're really seizing this time, this tumultuous time, as an opportunity to improve and revamp what they're doing and really think about how they can be more agile and more responsive and really generate innovations in their own ways.
So Chuck, I'm going to turn to you now because not to be as descriptive, but I know that you have some pretty strong points of view on some of this kind of stuff as to what the philanthropy world and the nonprofit world has has done in the past, and some of the ways in which you think this should foster some major rethinking.
Yeah, so Richard, very quickly, in late March, what we saw is a lot of philanthropists started to focus on the urgent, and we saw that there were the food lines, and we saw that there were a lot of unemployed. And one of the things that struck me was that we have the wealthiest developed country in the world, and yet 40% of the people in the food lines were single moms. You know, something is wrong with this picture. We had almost a 10,000 car line in down in Texas. We shouldn't have that. And so I think what ultimately they were solving the getting food to people, and that's good. But I think we ought to take the longer range picture of why are so many people poor? Why are they living month to month and the like? And one of the answers is we should be supporting marriage, where we know that those that are married are healthier, they live longer, they have 3 times the wealth. We have the data, and they're happier. And we have a government policy that since 1965 has sought to, it's not a war on poverty, it's been war on the low income people. We got to change that. And we're going to need philanthropic leadership because the government has to change. Number 2 is what we've, and we, by the way, lead National Marriage Week and the Strengthening Marriage. So what we do is we form coalitions. We are a leadership type of foundation. On the healthcare side, very briefly, we've looked at this, and you know, why are people dying in COVID? Well, if you go to Wuhan, you see that 10.5% of the mortality is from heart disease, 7.3% from diabetes, and if you have no chronic diseases, it's less than 1%. So the clear problem is chronic disease. It turns out 90% of all of the 3.5 trillion in healthcare costs is chronic diseases, and we need to fix this. So we formed a coalition, and happy to talk about that further.
Okay. All right. Now, Leslie, the reason I left you for last on this is, first of all, it's clear that unlike sometimes in panels where there's a clear consensus as to what the right approaches are, were we to have enough time on this, we would realize that I think in some underlying ways, we don't all approach this the same way. We don't all understand some of the systemic issues the same way, and even what the next steps are going to be. That doesn't make us wrong, but it does talk about what the role of philanthropy is. But I'm going to call on you because while a lot of us have been in this field for a long time, TPI does earn the role of being a thought leader. I don't like to throw that around loosely because a lot of people call themselves thought leaders, but TPI does. It was created specifically for the purpose of leading the thinking in the field even before it was doing advisory work. And so I'd like you to put some of this in perspective as to how you view some of the systemic kinds of questions and the responses that you're seeing, both looking backwards and looking forward.
Thank you, Richard, and really want to echo many of the comments that the other panelists have made, and we're seeing a lot of the same kinds of things. I will say there's been a strong push in the field of philanthropy and institutional philanthropy in particular to encourage funders to act quickly and provide emergency grants, support grantees, reach out to them, relax grant conditions and reporting requirements, all of those things. And all of those are good things from our perspective. We also have seen some very interesting and creative responses. And some of our clients, for example, have taken a step back and said, well, we can respond very quickly to certain situations where we feel it's very critical to allow our grantee partners to even just survive this period if they're at risk of going under or, you know, just having great difficulty. But in other cases, our clients and others in the field have thought about, well, what is really the highest and best use of philanthropy in this time? And thinking about that, it's pretty clear, given the magnitude of the situation, that the role of government is critical. And so for some funders, it's really a question of what can they do to best support and influence government and public policy. Some of them have I'll give one example.
Sure.
Have enlisted consulting organizations or nonprofits that can provide technical assistance to work with their grantee partners to apply for federal PPP loans. And many smaller grassroots organizations have not had necessarily the in-house capacity to be able to do that. So getting some outside support for that has been critical in terms of leveraging other resources. And I'll leave it at that, but many other examples of creativity.
Right. So I'm going to push in two directions, because if we listen carefully to your responses, there were, this is not a fair summary because there was a lot of nuances in what everybody said, but there were two kinds of responses, leaving aside the people that ignored it. That one response was, this is the rainy day we've been waiting for. Why are we driving our grantees, these nonprofit organizations that are barely making it, why are we driving them crazy? Let's drop our criteria. Let's drop our requirements and reporting. Let's just get that money out the door because they're vulnerable. They're not going to make it through no fault of their own. They may be wonderful organizations through no fault of their own. If we're going to hold back our money or insist on requirements, they're not going to do it. And they built on such things as trust-based philanthropy or participatory grant making, or the phrase, nothing about us without us, saying we're going to trust the recipients to tell us what they want to do with the money because they're on the ground, they're on the front lines, they're going to know better than we are. We're going to come back a little bit later to advocacy and larger questions. I don't want to dismiss that, but I want to come to that right away because that's certainly been a very, at least in the field, I don't know what people who are not in the field say, but that's certainly been a very powerful voice within our field. I'm curious how you respond to that, whether you think that that's going to change the way funders deal with nonprofits in the long run, or whether you think this is just a Band-Aid for the short term that's really going, and the funding world is going to go back to old ways of doing things in 6 months or a year when the pandemic is over, or when the election is over, whatever is going to happen that's going to change things. Anybody want to comment on that? And who wants to be the first? Raise your hand.
This is Kris. I'll comment on that. My prediction is, a great number of funders, family offices, donors will maintain many of these new best practices that they've been doing, making decisions faster, getting money out the door faster, loosening restrictions, offering core operating support so that nonprofits really can adapt as they need to and be agile and allocate their resources where they best see fit, which I think is great. However, I do actually think the vast majority of funders will go back to their old ways, unfortunately. But that's my prediction.
Okay. Others? Chuck?
Maybe I can jump in here a little bit. We're in a new world and we're adopting and we're learning new things that we never expected to be doing. And I think the key thing is that this is a wake-up call around the globe that we have healthcare costs spiraling out of control. Even if you go to Alzheimer's, you're going from 289 billion this year to an expected 1 trillion on a straight line basis in 2050. We cannot afford that. So what I hope the wake-up call is, we need to get this under control. And one of the goals of our foundation with the coalition is to get people in better physical shape, help that gets their immune system in better shape, and we can reduce chronic diseases by 30% by 2030. Sure. This is totally doable, and we need that kind of leadership going forward. Okay.
So what you're jumping ahead, and I'm happy to do it because it's so crucial to the discussion, is that that the part of the philanthropy world that is essentially opened the doors, as it were, and said, we're going to get the money out there as quickly as possible, is not taking a systemic view. It's saying that we have to provide Band-Aids because the system itself will not exist, or at least many parts of the system won't exist if we don't get that money out the door. What you're pushing, Chuck, is to say, if you don't do that with a kind of a longer perspective, a kind of systemic perspective, a kind of underlying recognition that whether it's in terms of economic inequity, racial inequity, health inequity, if you don't do that from an endemic and systemic perspective, the money's out the door and you haven't gotten enough out of it other than putting a Band-Aid on. So you have a very clear point of view. Ellen, I want to come to you. What are you seeing in terms of where on that balance are you seeing people? Is it all over?
I am seeing them all over, but I think initially because this was such an overwhelming crisis. And as Chuck was saying, seeing lines of cars and endless streams of people, who couldn't even put food on the table, relief and acting quickly and the Band-Aid was very important. I think as we go forward and people have a little more time to analyze and digest what's going on, I do hear many conversations about both the advocacy piece you spoke of and trying to deal with root causes and systemic problems. But I always see that tension with funders between how many people will suffer while we withdraw that funding that's more of a safety net, more of a Band-Aid, while we're experimenting, seeking, and looking for the answers that will really successfully address systemic change and core problems that are driving poverty and inequity and injustice in the country. I hear a lot of those conversations. I also hear another thing that wasn't brought up is, well, the families I'm working with now have been very quick and generous to support organizations and keep them afloat. They are also having some very serious conversations about, in the long term, are we going to continue to do this? Because no matter how great or interesting the program was, it's really about building a sustainable model. If you cannot run your not-for-profit in a way that it can manage through times of disaster, and there will be other disasters, are we just endlessly pumping money in and asking, do we let them sink or swim? Do we change gears and look at, no, we're not funding program, we're really funding capacity building, and people who are running not-for-profits have to sit down and take a hard look at their business model and how they operate and how they're going to really build resilience and be able to withstand whatever it is, a recession, a natural disaster.
Okay, so Leslie, I'm going to turn to you. Ellen started out saying that some of the people with whom she works, some with are seeing it's an either or. You either give to immediate need or you give to systemic advocacy or whatever you want to say. Do you feel that it really is an either or do you think our field has the capacity to recognize that there are both short-term needs and the ability to influence both policy and longer-term thinking at the same time? And Ellen, I know that you didn't mean it quite as strictly as that. I was just
no, but I do want to add. I think some of it comes that where people fall in that spectrum. I see it coming from two places: how they funded heretofore, and also emotional connections. When people are very emotionally connected to whatever these organizations are, even if they often have a real governance model in place or a strategy, it's very hard not to react emotionally. So I see a lot of emotion-driven philanthropy at this time. But as I said, as people step back, I think they'll look for some type of balance on that spectrum.
Okay, now I'm going to turn to Leslie to.
Yeah, I think there's room for all different types of approaches and ways to think about roles for philanthropy. And I think we see that if we look around. We talk about the difference between charity and philanthropy. And many donors really want to do both and feel it's important to do both. When we talk about philanthropy, we really like to talk about it as thinking strategically, setting goals. To Chuck's point, are there things that you really want to try to accomplish that will make this world better? And being creative and thinking about the best ways to get there. When we started up 31 years ago, that was somewhat of a novel idea outside of the large institutional foundations. It's certainly become increasingly common for funders to want to be more strategic and to take that type of approach. So we're seeing an increase in that direction, but certainly I would say for many, many funders, it's a mix of approaches.
So I want to now switch to the question of advocacy. But interestingly enough, there was a question that came in, and I'm going to push the question of advocacy in two different directions, in a certain way, two opposite directions. Advocacy number one is, and Chuck said this correctly, or maybe we all said it, that everybody knows that no matter how much money you put from the private philanthropy world on the table, it doesn't come close to what government can support. We all know that. And there's people that believe otherwise, but the numbers just prove that over and over and over again. So one element that we hear is that if we're serious about addressing endemic and systemic issues, we've got to use our money to leverage so that we get better public policy. So that's one, and I'd like you to talk about that in a minute. But we had a question that actually pushed advocacy, ironically, in a totally opposite direction. Are we using our advocacy with the nonprofit world to make sure that they work better, that they're more efficient, that they merge if they can, that we cut out needless duplication? I want to be careful, just because people are doing similar things doesn't mean they're needlessly duplicative, but pushing, should the funder world, which is our world, be more assertive with the nonprofit world, so to help them be more sustainable down the road, and that's a role that we can play, or is that micromanaging one step too far? So I'm going to push the advocacy question in both opposite directions, Kris, why don't you come in on this?
Yeah, so two things. One is, absolutely supporting policy advocacy and systems change and addressing the root causes of issues is incredibly important. And there's a huge role for funders to play in doing that. And there's a huge role for funders to play in supporting their nonprofit partners in doing that, because often they're the ones that are best positioned to mobilize community members and legislators and create those changes. So I think that's a really important tool for any funder's toolbox. But I also think that, to your second point, I don't want funders to substitute one kind of micromanaging for another kind of micromanaging. So part of the problem that the nonprofit sector is in right now is because of a scarcity mindset that donors have. Sort of this misguided belief that, we can't spend any money on overhead. Overhead is somehow bad. And, we only dole out little bits of money 1 year at a time, requiring lots of reporting. And it causes these nonprofit organizations to kind of go crazy. I mean, we would never launch a military, battle that way, right? We wouldn't, if a Fortune 500 company launched a new product line that way, it probably wouldn't be very successful. But yet we expect nonprofits to be successful when they're really hamstrung by a lot of our policies as donors and procedures and restrictions that we put on nonprofits. And so as a result, they become very fearful. They lack the time, the bandwidth, the capacity to really do a lot of the big thinking, to merge two nonprofit organizations, for example, which could be a great idea. That takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And if you're running around chasing money, you don't have that kind of time. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea to, because I think one of the values that funders bring beyond money is perspective, is a bird's eye view on a field and being able to see the bigger picture. And if that can be brought to bear and help nonprofits, if we as donors can provide them with funding to become more effective, to merge effectively, and to increase their impact, that sounds great.
Okay, so we can talk about that a long time. There is an entire school of thought that surfaced over the last few years that said that even that perspective may be, quote, privilege, and that the most at-risk populations get intimidated by that privilege and don't feel free to share the information. So while it may be true that we have perspective because of where we sit, that doesn't mean we know everything. And it's important for us to bear that in mind. We can be wrong. Chuck, I know you feel strongly about this question.
I do, and I'm really disappointed in a lot of philanthropists because they don't focus on, you hear the word advocacy and what a nice word that is, but are you going to have impact on advocacy? We're what I call a leadership of philanthropy. We have actually changed the nation's thinking on things, as documented by being on the cover of Time magazine. So we know how to do that. There aren't many people that know how to do it. And I think that what we need is good public policy and good leadership in philanthropy. And then I'd say number two, very quickly, is that I'm a private equity guy. And we go on boards of companies. For some reason, the philanthropists often just sort of back off and don't get involved at all. I think that's a total mistake. I believe that we need to take a venture capital approach to philanthropy where people come in, do multi-year funding, make sure that the funding is right, make introductions, make sure there's a good strategy. It's ridiculous not to get more involved. So that's my view.
Okay, so Ellen, I'm going to ask you to comment on this, but I just want to remind those who are listening, watching, that in fact the flexibility to do some of the things that Chuck talked about are built into the rules related to both private giving and foundation giving, whether they're program-related investments or mission-related investments, where we actually can use our resources as funders to have that kind of impact through private investments, even consistent with our philanthropy. So they're not mutually exclusive kinds of approaches.
Not at all.
Yeah. So Ellen, why don't you come in on this?
Look, there's a lot of tools in the toolbox. People can be doing recoverable grants, there's loans, access to capital is a huge thing. We've seen a real uptick in people doing microloans, and even on our platform, which traditionally didn't support that, we're doing that both domestically and internationally. I think sometimes the mindset of investing rather than even philanthropy, investing means you're trying to build something and see it succeed, as opposed to philanthropy is kind of giving out money and did they address everything we listed in the RFP. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one way. In terms of advocacy and mergers and that whole spectrum, one very interesting thing I've seen going on is much more coalition building. And I think that's an interesting bridge that doesn't necessitate going so far as merging or closing, but organizations. It was a great example in Atlanta that just occurred, where all of these arts organizations that now had to have all kinds of technology, they're going to be working virtually for who knows how long. And it's very expensive to have PR, promote yourself, keep your brand out there in front of people. They came together on a unified platform where they can all be presenting, where they can all be promoting. That took out a huge piece of the budget right there that they would have to face independently in terms of the consultants, the technology, the PR. And now as a unit, and also the whole was larger than the sum of its parts. It made a really big splash. All of a sudden people said, wow, arts are still alive in Atlanta, look at this. And ultimately, I think it's really going to help their fundraising and their relationship with their individual funders.
So what you're talking about now, and I think given only a few minutes left, I want to pick up, I don't know how many people can see this. This is from the most recent Chronicle of Philanthropy. And the headline says, it's a challenging question. Is this in fact a defining moment for philanthropy? It's always good to have a little something to show. But the question I want to end with, because we don't have that much time, and I think we probably could spend another hour or so, do we really believe that this is a defining moment for philanthropy? Do we really believe that either the nonprofit sector, the private giving sector, whether it's through donor advised funds or private foundations or out of people's personal pockets, is going to change the way it does things? Is there going to be public policy change as a result of these catastrophic challenges to American society on an equity level and on a health level? Or will people decide that there shouldn't be endowments in foundations, or that the money spent today is much more important than the money spent tomorrow? Will they go back to setting up the kind of restrictions that Kris was talking about before? Or in fact, is this going to lead to a new openness of relationship between grantees and funders? So with a few minutes left, I'd like us to talk about what we think are going to be the lasting impact on our field of this of these 4 months going forward.
Can I address that, Richard?
Sure.
We're in COVID. It doesn't look. I think we're going to be here maybe 1 or possibly 2 years longer. So we've had a dramatic shift. We're not going back to a lot of stuff. Now, hopefully, we have healthcare costs that are out of control. We have budgets in the state of Texas. They're facing a $30 billion budget. The problem that they have to balance. So philanthropists are going to have to step in because the government can't do all of this stuff. We have to get healthcare costs under control. That's why we set up the goal of a reduction of 30% of chronic diseases by 2030. And if anyone wants to talk to me about it, it's chuck@stetsonfamilyoffice.com. But I think we have to go after it.
Okay. Others, this is an important topic. Who'd like to go next? Leslie, why don't you go?
Yeah, I do think this is a defining moment. I don't know that I can be specific about what those changes will be and how trends will evolve, because I do believe that there will continue to be many, many different approaches to philanthropy, and that's almost by definition what philanthropy is all about. But I do think that many funders see their philanthropy as society's risk capital.
Okay.
And it's an opportunity to step up and perhaps reflect on how things have been done in the past and how things might be done differently given the times that we're in and given all of the different influences right now. And one thing I will say, I think that there's a tendency to think about each of the sectors separately. So we talk about government, we talk about nonprofits, philanthropy, the business sector. I think one of the areas that really could be an area for growth and development is multi-sectoral partnerships. And, you know, we talk about advocacy and philanthropy trying to influence public policy. I worked in government many, many years ago, and I've spent a lot of years now in philanthropy. I think it can really be a two-way street.
Okay.
And
So Leslie, real quick, because I'm sorry, real quick, because I know that our time is winding down. Just since Chuck was so good about putting his email out there to follow up on his things, how do people reach you?
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, opine@tpi.org or go to www.tpi.org.
Good. Terrific. Okay. Kris, you go next. We have just a couple minutes left for us to wind down. You've already told us about your book, so that's terrific.
So, you know, I do believe it's a defining moment, and I do believe philanthropy really has to step into it and own this moment. I believe that in order for donors and funders to create transformational change in the world, that we need to transform how we give, and that's really important. I think, you know, it is, as Chuck said earlier, we are living in a new world, and any strategy that existed before this crisis cannot possibly remain intact, you know, post-crisis or right now. And I think it's really important for funders to create, you know, revise, revamp, refresh their strategies to make sure that they're agile. And I think these strategies really need to incorporate addressing systematic changes. You know, so if you're going to tackle education, you have to tackle the systemic failures of the digital divide, for example. And I think, you know, to create lasting real change and increase equity, we have to address institutionalized racism in this country, or we're not making a difference.
And Kris, if they want to reach you real quickly.
Yeah, my website is putnam-consulting.com.
Okay. Ellen, you'll be penultimate, and then I'll wind it down.
Okay. Well, you know, I really agree with what Kris and Leslie just said. I think this is a moment in time that can be transformational. I do think many funders are thinking deeply about what they funded and how they funded and how they can do better. I do think going forward, philanthropy will be a little less top down, and that there will be at least a greater effort towards building trust and openness between the funders and the grantees. And I already see a move among the funders I work with to seek out charities where the stakeholders, the ultimate recipients, really have some kind of representation in the charity, so that all voices are being heard, and looking for charities where they're being led by the people who are ultimately going to be impacted by their grant making. We've seen a big uptick. We saw overall a 13% increase in giving this year. Most of it happened from March through year end, and that's in grants going out, as well as an uptick in contributions coming in. And this year, I think JCF is going to distribute more than 26% of all assets under management.
Okay. And real quickly, because I want to just give one last sentence, because go ahead, and they can
Ellen.
reach you.
Okay,
Ellen?
Ellen at jcfny.org.
All right, and they're sponsors, so you can go to the lounge or whatever and talk to Ellen directly.
That is.
Yeah. Okay. So just two final sentences, because we're getting the signal that people have to go to have lunch together. First of all, in my case, you can reach me through our website, which also is a blog site, wisephilanthropy.com. You'll see a whole bunch of articles about both the racial equity issues as well as the COVID-19 response by philanthropy. And I want to say that I think that my own prediction is that there's going to be some long-term changes in terms of the requirements of funders, but I suspect that power and privilege are really hard to give up. And I suspect the boardrooms of decision-making are going to be the last place where funders are going to share power. That's not true everywhere, but I think that's the last place. And it says something about what it means to be in our privileged position to be able to give money away to make a difference. It's an incredible privilege to do that. And as we struggle with what our responsibilities are, we should never lose sight of that unique privilege that we have. Thank you, panelists. Thanks, fellow. It was terrific. I know that we could easily spend a lot more time, but I want to thank everybody for the time, and I want to thank all of the viewers for some questions and for the enthusiastic response that I know is out there. We'll see you at the lunchtime and continue the discussions in other settings. Thanks much.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Richard, Leslie, Ellen, Kris, and Chuck for talking us through this and hopefully alleviating some philanthropic anxiety. If you guys have any additional questions for any of the panelists or the moderator, please feel free to shoot them a message in the messaging feature in the platform. We're going to